Welcome to Navigating Hope, your compass to health empowerment. I'm Dr. Jaime Hope, steering you through healthcare, overcoming overwhelm, personal goals, and emergencies. We'll navigate the healthcare maze with actionable insights and real-world advice, unlocking the secrets to a healthier, more vibrant life. Join us to take control of your well-being and make informed decisions for your health and your future. Stay with us as we unravel the mysteries of medicine, wellness, and life's unforeseen challenges, helping you bypass the ER with a dose of knowledge. Stay tuned till the end of the episode with a recap of your actionable insights and a free gift. Let's chart a course to your well-being together. All right, welcome back to another episode of Navigating Hope. I am so excited to be here today with Elreacy Dock, who is a thanatologist. Did I even say that part right? I said your name right. Thanatologist.
Yes. Thanatologist.
Yes, which is a certified grief educator, death educator, and she's a global behavioral health expert with several years of experience. She was trained and certified by top grief expert David Kessler, and her expertise pertains to death, dying, grief, loss, end-of-life care, and medical aid in dying. Elreacy serves as the Department of Thanatology chairwoman at Capstone University, where she actively teaches students enrolled in graduate level program that she developed. She's also a contributing writer at Seven Ponds, where she serves up subject matter for common questions surrounding end-of-life decision-making, funeral practices, bioethics at the end of life, and other death-positive topics. And what I love is that she also has grief groups for people. So if you're not a member of her program or educational program, but you're struggling with grief, there are still possibilities. So let's jump in. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Jaime.
This is going to be a lot of fun. So let's start by, this is not a common profession.
Right.
I was joking, kind of, my high school guidance counselor didn't even tell me that this existed. But immediately I see the value that death and dying is a natural part of our life experiences, and it's something we're all going to experience, but there's a lot of emotions around it. So how did you even enter this as a profession?
So I kind of stumbled upon it. I think a lot of times when we think about grief, we think about counseling. And initially I was studying psychology in undergrad, but I didn't want to be a grief counselor because I felt like something was missing there, right? So at some point I decided to take a course on the sociology of death and dying because I thought, okay, this is really interesting. I had a huge interest in sociology. I also had a huge interest in psychology. I'm like, this kind of intersects with that. And so in that course, I discovered that the first sociologists were also thanatologists. And they came up with some of the theories that we still use in thanatology today. And I looked into that and I was like, thanatology. I wonder if there's, any actual progress in this area. Like, is this, because I had never heard of it at that point either, right? So like, do people actually work as thanatologists? I looked into it. There was 1 degree granting program at the time. And I was like, I'm going to try to get into this program. So I kind of pivoted what I was studying in undergrad, and that's how I fell into it, essentially.
I love those kind of the stumbled into the right career origin stories. I think it's so fascinating because there's just all these little things that led you to this amazing place.
Yeah. And, it's one of those things where since I already had an interest in grief, as you can imagine, like I had experienced losses in my life. I had gone through the process of seeing individuals with terminal illnesses and holding their hands as they were dying and being in those settings. And so I knew I wanted to do something with death and dying. And there were certainly, layers of experiences that contributed to that as well. But it was really one of those just-in-time discoveries, that led me to be a thanatologist. So
that is fantastic. I think the whole concept around death and dying, there are some cultural differences.
mm-hmm.
There's a lot associated with it. But so kind of how we're going to do this podcast, how you and I decided together, is timeline style. Yes. So starting from what you termed anticipatory grief to then
Mhm.
that immediate time after the death where people are super supportive and they're bringing you casseroles and that stuff, and then to the prolonged experience where people start telling you, oh, you should be over it by now. So I'm really excited. So start with anticipatory grief. What is that?
So, anticipatory grief is essentially the grief that you experience before your loved one has died.
Mm.
It can start as soon as receiving that prognosis that maybe there's only a certain amount of time left, or it can be based off of what you're noticing as a caregiver. So, if you notice that their health is starting to decline, you know that they are perhaps dealing with a chronic disease that is progressing more rapidly than you expected, or if you're dealing even with diseases such as dementia, this is very common among caregivers of people with dementia. And so you start grieving not only that loss, but the loss of the person that you know day by day, because they are losing, bodily functions, they're losing sometimes their ability to communicate with you. And so you grieve that a little bit every day, but you're also thinking about when you finally lose them. And so it's always with you.
That's that's kind of a lot of things to unpack. So you're losing them as you knew they were to be,
Yeah.
whether their strength, their personality. I mean, certainly with dementia, it starts to rob you of who you were as a person.
Hmm.
And that people with something like a cancer diagnosis, it robs you of the health, the future possibilities, all the travel you had planned, and then knowing that death is coming.
Yes. And so actually what you've highlighted there, those are secondary losses. So you have your main loss, which is the death of your loved one. And then
Hmm.
all of those different components that you named are secondary losses. So like, loss of expectations, loss of plans, a dream, loss of just financial security. Maybe you're not prepared to go through caregiving at home. Maybe you're not prepared to make final arrangements. Most people can't afford their funeral after all. So,
Yeah, that's a whole separate. Wow,
right.
that's an expensive process.
Yeah, so there's all of these things, and a lot of times what happens is people are dealing with that initial loss, and then all these other losses start piling up, and they're like, wait a minute, my life is completely changing, and it's changing very quickly.
Yeah, so people kind of acknowledge and accept grief after their death. But do you feel like there's less societal acceptance if you start grieving some of those things before they've passed away?
Yes. Yeah, because a lot of times what's happening in those scenarios is you'll hear people sort of disenfranchise the person that's taking care of the individual who is dying. And you'll hear things like, well, they're with you now. Make the most of the time that you have with them now. And okay, that's great to be fully present and to make those memories while you have the opportunity, but that doesn't just detract from the actual grief process.
Yeah, I feel like that's a little bit of toxic positivity. When my kids are, screaming at the grocery store and one of them pooped and it got everywhere and the other one's there and some lady behind you is like, oh my gosh, cherish every moment. I'm like, well, I'm not exactly cherishing this right this second. It's so invalidating. I'm like, it doesn't mean I don't cherish them, but that moment wasn't stellar. Um,
Right.
and that happens too when people say, oh, appreciate every minute. But when I've had loved ones who have passed with cancer or are struggling with dementia, you can love every minute and still not invalidate the feelings that you are experiencing, which are so real.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
Okay, so anticipatory grief. Anything else about that would be helpful to know other than just validating this experience is so real and it's okay to feel what you feel?
So I think when it comes to anticipatory grief, it's important for us to approach it with, this openness of feeling those feelings. Yes, people in society are going to tell you otherwise, but if you need to take a moment and cry because you are burnt out and you're having a difficult day, and maybe your loved one didn't remember your name or they couldn't make it to the bathroom or any number of scenarios, that's okay. Cry it out. And if people are invalidating you, sometimes it's good to just avoid that. Avoid whoever is invalidating you until you feel a little bit more prepared to navigate those conversations.
Hallelujah. Because it's not up to them to decide how you should feel.
Right. Yeah. They're not experiencing your grief. So how can they give you, actual guidance on it.
They don't feel what you're feeling.
Yeah.
Okay, so now as we approach the actual event itself, the death, like, so kind of walk us through that.
So in the context of they are probably a few days from dying, or
Yeah, start from there and then through to the death. And
okay, so most likely what is happening in those instances, depending on, what illness or disease the individual is dying of, you're going to see some key indicators, right? A lot of times you hear about the death rattle, or you see that perhaps your loved one, now it can go two ways. Some individuals they'll perk up. They will suddenly have this burst of energy, and you might even think like, oh, they're getting better, because there's that part of you that wants to hope that they're going to recover and that things are going to improve. So you have those opportunities. But a lot of times that happens just before they die. The other side of that spectrum is that sometimes they become, less interactive. They're suddenly super fatigued. They're sleeping longer. When you try to wake them up, they're not waking up that easily, or they're going right back to sleep. And so you get these indicators, and depending on if you're working with a hospice or not, it's a good time to call them and find out what's going on, and they can sort of give you a guide on how long your loved one might have. But during that time, a lot of what people experience is either they are overwhelmed by emotion, or if they've been going through anticipatory grief for quite some time, they experience something that is known as absent grief. Now, absent grief is not the experience of having like, oh, everything's fine, but it's just the perspective of, I've been grieving so long that now I can't express these emotions anymore. Expressed all I can express at this time. And it doesn't mean that you're never going to grieve about it. It's very common for individuals to say that they feel numb. It's very common for people to just not grieve at all if they've been dealing with anticipatory grief, or to say that they're at peace with it. But they find later on down the road, like maybe a year later, or depending on what's going on, that it comes back and they start grieving again because those emotions are still there.
yeah, they don't really go away. Some of us are good at stuffing them down, but that unfortunately does not cure them.
Yeah, exactly. Still there. It's just in a different space in your mind and in your heart.
Okay. So, as somebody is pronounced dead,
Mhm.
I mean, as a physician, that's kind of how I look at it. Like, okay, you were pronounced like, this is your time of death. So we know for certainty the death has occurred. And then, in my experience in the ER, having seen this countless times, I've seen all sorts of reaction from kind of the numb that you're describing. I've seen denial. I've seen very loud reactions. And there's various cultural responses that are kind of typical with death, and there's our internal experience. So let's talk about the spectrum of responses to the death news.
Yeah, so that can really vary, as you highlighted, based off of culture. There's certainly some cultures where the reaction and the response is very loud. I've seen, scenarios where someone has died and the family is wailing loudly. I've seen situations where everyone is just quiet, and maybe someone wants to cry, but they're holding that back because it's not culturally appropriate. I've also seen some situations where no one wants to express anything until everyone is out of the room. And that sometimes is not so much cultural, but more of a instance that's based off of a relationship dynamic. Perhaps they were raised not to express their emotions about grief, or perhaps they're not comfortable grieving around a specific person that's in the room. So that can be prominent too.
Okay. Is there a right reaction or a wrong reaction?
No, there's not really any wrong reactions. People can grieve however they feel most comfortable. And I always say that, if you need to express your grief in a way that feels right for you, do that. Do not shrink yourself down, and do not shrink your grief down to make the other people in the room comfortable.
Okay. So can you talk about some cultural differences in end of life practices that people see and funeral practices?
Yeah. So I think one of the most interesting things, particularly like when you look at American culture versus other cultures, is that other cultures have a much more extensive timeline for the mourning period compared to here in the United States. It can range anywhere from weeks to months in some cultures, whereas here in the United States, it's really more of a like situation where your loved one died, you deal with it for a week or so if you get bereavement leave, and then you deal with it privately. But in other cultures, this is more of a community experience. There's a lot of collective grieving in other cultures. So it's less personal and more shared among individuals. In terms of funeral practices, there are a lot of rituals that are used in the context of the afterlife, or also just in the context of wanting to ensure that your loved one has a good progression in the afterlife. So, for example, some people, when you go back to the concept of how we react to grief, there are some cultures, Indonesia in particular, where if you are crying when you are grieving, you are not allowed to let a tear touch the body of the deceased, because if you do that, is going to have a negative impact on them in the afterlife.
Huh.
So there are certain things like that which are done in a very mindful manner in order to make sure that their loved ones can progress in whichever way they are informed by their religious or cultural, values, essentially.
Oh, that's so interesting. I love how different cultures kind of celebrate it differently, all with the same idea to honor the loved one and help with the grieving. But I'd love to circle back to the point where you said it's almost like we're given a deadline. So you're
Yeah.
allowed to, you're allowed to cry when they die, you're allowed to cry at the funeral, and then there seems like the longer you go past that, there seems to be mounting pressure
Mhm.
to get, quote, get over it. So what are your thoughts about that?
So I think in general, our society it's very inclined towards death anxiety, death denial, and we don't like to be in scenarios that put us in discomfort. And one of the things that has the most social stigma about it is death and grief, right? So it's very interesting, just our reactions to grief in particular, because when we're experiencing grief, it's different, right? But if we see someone else experiencing it, we're like, oh, well, I don't know why she's not over that yet. But it's not that simple. Anyone who has experienced a loss has understood that. So I think the thing is like, even if we were to make a more realistic timeline, okay, you would have anticipatory grief when your loved one is still here and is ill. You would have acute grief, which is right after the death has happened, like it has just happened in that moment. You would have early grief, and early grief is sort of within it's the first 2 years after a death. And then you would have mature grief, and that's essentially the grief that we carry for the rest of our lives. And what a lot of people find is that actually the second year of grief is more difficult than the first year of grief, because people stop checking in on you. They stop, seeing if you're okay. You get removed from friend groups. Perhaps you become more isolated. A lot of relationship dynamics change. But these are all factors that are influenced by our society and our norms surrounding death. So,
Do you think it's because people are uncomfortable? Like, if you have a loved one or a friend who's experiencing a prolonged grief, it prolonged in the US is, more longer than a couple of months, and
mm,
it's all they want to talk about. And it seems like other people then want to distance themselves because they're uncomfortable and they're not sure what to say.
yeah, I think it's a lot to do with the discomfort of it, because
Yeah.
if we see someone in pain and we care about them, we want to do something to ease their pain. But there's nothing you can do to ease their pain because you can't bring back their loved one. So the only thing you can really do is you can listen. You can, witness their grief. You can be supportive. You can do proactive things to support them, but you can't give them advice, right? And you can't really do anything to fill that void. So, and people don't know how to navigate that. And then, especially if you think about it in the context of there are so many people that are uncomfortable with expressing emotions. So if someone's not comfortable expressing their own emotions, then they can't be emotionally intelligent enough to provide the same level of support to another person.
Right.
Yeah.
So if we made a list of things that are helpful versus not helpful for
Mhm.
somebody who is experiencing grief. So helpful, you said kind of listen, witness their grief, don't invalidate. Anything else on the helpful list so we know what we can do to support a friend or a loved one who's grieving?
Yeah, so I would say a couple of things come to mind. First, avoid those situations and scenarios where you're saying, well, at least you got to spend those last moments with them.
Oh, yeah.
Or, maybe this is leading to a new chapter in your life. Those are not good things to say. People think that they're a positive approach, but it's not helpful. It's upsetting. For people who have lost like a child, for example, or it can be really any loved one, say their names. There's so many times where they avoid saying their names because they don't want to hurt that person. But the reality is, just because you lose your person doesn't mean that you don't want to talk about them anymore. You still love your person, right? So using their names, talking about them, sharing memories is always good. Another thing is when people are grieving, they are exhausted, right? It's very hard to keep up with certain types of routines, even as something as simple as feeding yourself. You're so tired, you don't feel like cooking. So sometimes a great thing to do is to make a meal train for that person and have foods prepared or send a gift card or something like that so that they can just warm something up when they're hungry. It's simple and it gives them the strength to keep doing the things they need to do.
I love those ideas. I think that that's so important. And not just, for some people, I've done it not right after the funeral because there's so many other people doing it. But,
Mhm.
when everyone else gets back to their real life and back to work, and this person is now in the grieving process, that seems like a good time to continue that support, to continue the listening, say their name, send some food. we all,
Yeah,
all need food, right? That's the comfort around any
exactly.
ritual.
Yes, exactly. Food is always a win-win situation in most, instances. So,
Oh, that is fantastic. And then if there's somebody who is grieving somebody, oh,
mhm.
actually, well, before I get to that, because I was gonna say if they feel kind of stuck in it, what about just kind of normal instances? So I have a nephew who passed away as an infant, who would be
Mhm.
a teenager now, and sometimes I'll see my other nephews and my kids playing, and so what would be his cousins, and think, gosh, I wonder what he would be like. I wonder if he would be the tallest of all these. I wonder if he would like our fantasy football draft. And
Yeah.
or the other day when I reached for the phone to call my mother in law, who I'm well aware passed away in 2017, but just something reminded me of her and I went to call her. Are those grief moments? Are they beautiful memories? Well, how would you characterize that experience?
So I would say that these are probably combinations of not only grief moments, but also the natural neurobiology that exists with your brain. So essentially, what happens is when you love someone, your brain has networks of neurons that help you to function every single day, right? And when you love someone, those neurons make firing patterns based around your person. So, for example, if you called your mom every single time something important happened or every day, you have a firing pattern for that. But what happens is that when you lose that person, your brain has to rely on memories in order to determine what action it should take because now it's being interrupted every time it realizes that there's a loss. And this is unfamiliar. Your brain is designed to protect you, right? It's designed to recognize danger, unusual situations, and when you have the unfamiliarity due to loss, that can trigger your flight or fright, right? So, what your brain is doing is there's something called automaticity, and that's how you go through your day to day routines just automatically without having to really think about it. It refers to those memories during that process. And so that's why you reach out. But it's also, connected with your emotions. You love that person. That person was a prominent, influence in your life. So you're always going to remember them. So it's a combination, really.
Oh, that's fascinating. And those moments make me happy. I find them Very helpful. So, if there's somebody who feels like they are stuck, and I'm not talking about other people telling them they've been grieving too long or telling them to get over it, not that like invalidating thing, but if they themselves feel like they're not sure how to move forward or handle the weight of their grief, what would you recommend for them for resource for getting help?
So I think if someone is feeling stuck, the first thing we have to really ask ourselves in that scenario is by what standard are they
Right.
stuck? Do they feel stuck because they're comparing themselves to someone else who is grieving? And so they think, well, they seem to be getting over it. What's wrong with me? I think we have to realize that a lot of times people internalize their grief. And even if they seem completely fine on the outside, they're carrying a lot of pain on the inside. If the person feels like, okay, maybe it's been 2 or 3 years and I'm still really not in a good stage with my grief process, then there's other things you can do. You can look into things like practicing mindfulness to help you be more present in the moment. You can look into working with mental health professionals. There's lots of wonderful grief specialists out there that can certainly help you navigate that process. Or you can also just think about it from the context of what have you allowed yourself to feel? What have you allowed yourself to really process about that grief? And when I say that, I mean it in the context of, you know, our daily lives are so hectic. When was the last time that you were able to sit down in a quiet space, reflect on your loss, reflect on what has happened, reflect on how that has changed you, and really just come face to face with it and not be distracted by phone calls or work or people trying to contact you or responsibilities. And a lot of times that kind of helps is just getting to know yourself after a loss, because the person you are after a loss is different from the person you were before the loss.
Oh, what a beautiful like death positive acknowledgement. I love that. I love that. I love that term. Where did that come from? Is that one of your terms?
That's not one of my terms. Death positivity, I believe, was actually created by Caitlin Doughty. She is an amazing influencer in the death care space. But it's really about death positive thinking, and the death positive movement is really about breaking down these stigmas by having these open conversations about death and dying, and sort of detangling all of these emotions and thought processes that we have about death and grief and why we feel that way, and addressing the myths that exist. So,
I love that. So, I mean, death has been a part of the human experience since the beginning of the human experience, right? It's
yes.
all throughout history. This is not a field you would expect technological advances, right? You'd expect medications to stop death and all that kind of stuff. But no matter what amazing medications we come up with, it is inevitable. So, tell me about technological advances in AI around death.
Oh, now see, this is like a passion of mine.
I mean,
Yeah.
this is fascinating. It's not something a lot of people probably have on their radar.
Yeah. So, probably when I first became a thanatologist, we were just starting to explore AI and deep learning models and all of these things. And so I had a project at the time that was essentially pertaining to collecting patient vitals and important, healthcare information that you would have for any patient if they were admitted, feeding that into a deep learning model, and then using that deep learning model to determine how close the patient was to death. And then based off of that, it would help prioritize those patients in hospices and hospitals to ensure that they were receiving care more immediately and that their families were notified if they were getting closer to death, right? But at the time, artificial intelligence was so new that a lot of folks were like, I don't think this is going to catch on. And I was like, no, it's going to catch on. Well, now with AI, this has like expanded to an unbelievable amount now. So it's kind of going in two different directions. On one hand, you have individuals who want to use AI and technology to extend life, because the idea is that If you can somehow contain the human consciousness in AI, then that person can live forever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's one possibility you have. And this is sometimes also deeply, connected with biohacking, but that goes into a
Yeah.
completely different area. I could talk about that for a while too. But the opposite end of that spectrum is that you have chatbots. And so there are a lot of these AI chatbots that are emerging, and people are using them to try to gain closure with their loved ones because they're grieving. So, perhaps their mom died, they go and they reach out to a chatbot and they feed the chatbot the information that their mom would typically know. And then they start having conversations with this chatbot. Now, is it good? Is it bad? That kind of varies. For some people, they get their conversation, they get closure, everything's okay. There's other people that they have complicated grief, they have grief disorders, and they become so attached to talking to this chatbot that they cannot have a normal interaction with anyone. And so that's where it becomes dangerous. And that's where it's like, we have to figure out a way to do this ethically where it doesn't cause harm to people, right? But there's many, many advances in AI and technology, and even in regards to burials, that's becoming a thing as well.
Well, how with burials is that? Are we using AI?
So the interesting thing about burials, and like when you look at just the amount of people that are consistently dying on a regular basis, we're eventually going to run out of room at cemeteries, right? And so the thing is, the new approach to that is to create cemeteries that sort of make use of AI and AR technology and VR and pulls up your loved one's digital profile. There's also these sorts of experiences where perhaps you have like a traditional headstone, but you have a QR code on the headstone and you scan it with your phone and it pulls up this digital memorial for your loved one. So eventually the goal is, in order to save space and to not have all of these materials that are harmful to the earth buried in the ground, to scan this, have it in a little area, and you have your own memorial that only you can see because it's responsive to your QR code and not anything else.
That is so fascinating. I have found in my very non like professional thanatologist experience, some people find it very helpful to visit the grave of their loved one. They want to do that on a regular basis. I have not personally found it helpful because to me that's not where they are.
Right.
My grief to that it exists in a different space, but neither experience is good or bad, right or wrong. It's just what is comforting. So this like a memorial that you could take wherever then if because if you feel attached to their gravesite and then you move, then I assume there's probably some emotion around leaving
Yeah.
it.
Exactly. Yeah, because then you can't go see them whenever you want to. So if you have that, I mean, even this can even be applied to urns. You can have the QR code put on a urn and you can scan it and you can look at it when you're at home. That's another prominent thing. So it doesn't even have to be directly on the gravestone if you don't want it to be.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
So, circling back to these chatbots, because I have just recently started learning about these from people, and it is very fascinating. So there's, the thought of and saying stuff that your loved one would have said after death, but I assume there's also a market for people, to try and get their parent or loved one to say as much as they can into the chatbot before they pass. So you talked about the ethics of that. So
Yeah.
whether we're utilizing it in exclusion of living people or kind of as a thing, how would you find that line, and how would you with your ethics background address that if you feel like it's kind of become a non helpful coping mechanism?
So this is actually a really interesting topic that is still actively in development because the problem is when you are feeding that into an AI model, essentially you are using someone's likeness, their thoughts, etc., right? But a lot of states in the United States of America do not have neuroethic laws. And so we're having to build these neuroethic laws around this because you're literally using someone's likeness without their permission. They are no longer alive. They can't.
Interesting.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so there's a lot of interesting legislature that's happening in some states regarding neuroethics and just how you navigate those scenarios. I think in terms of, whether it's doing harm or not, it really depends on a case by case basis. There are some people that they have 1 to 2 chats and that's enough for them. And they even feel a little uncomfortable because they're like, well, the chat bot told me this, but I don't think, my loved one would have actually said that. I'm going to stop talking with it, right? But then there's some people that, especially depending on what program they're using, they've done this for months. And the more information you feed it, the more it becomes identical and accurate to the person that you loved. So that's where it becomes a little hazy because if it's impacting your ability to have interactions with other people, and if you genuinely believe that you're talking with your loved one, that's a bit problematic, right? And likewise, removing the chatbot in that instance might cause even more damage.
Like another grief?
Right,
Oh,
yeah, because you're losing the person twice at that point. You're losing your person plus this representation of your
oh
person.
boy. Another
So,
one. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay. Wow. It gets complicated as in the law, the technology is always moving faster than the law, right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, even now, I'm sure you've seen news stories where you've seen like AI models are saying certain things, and people are like, "Oh, we don't know how it came out with that outcome." And it's like, well, we should probably address that. At some point, we need to figure out what the key indicator is that stops it. There has to be something in the system that says, okay, this is going to go in the wrong direction and stop it. But that requires more people that are specifically studying death and dying and grief in the context of AI and death tech. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Wow. So that I can see this whole new field expanding. Are you teaching about this in the course that you're teaching? Is that included in the
Um,
curriculum? I know it's a newer topic.
Yeah, so I touch about it a little bit in my Intro to Thanatology course, but I'm actually building out a separate course that's just going to pertain solely to death, dying, and technology because it's such a prominent issue right now and no one is discussing it. So,
Right.
yeah.
Nice. So for us non thanatologists, so if we're not enrolled in your course, how can we get, because the internet is filled with, all kinds of nonsense and non-helpful stuff. How can we find resources that are helpful and useful to guide us through this process?
So I would generally recommend looking at, there are a lot of amazing foundations that pertain to grief, loss, and death and dying. Perhaps one of the best ones is the Association for Death Education and Counseling. They
Mm.
have tons of resources, not only for people that are professionals in the death industry, but also people that are grieving. But there's also foundations that are specific to the type of loss that someone has had. So, for example, there's like a foundation for those that have lost a child. There's a foundation for those that have lost someone to suicide. And so really pivoting it towards these evidence-based, dependable organizations is the best option there because when you start looking at random things on the internet, you never know if you're getting credible information or even if you're going to get scammed.
Yeah. And you brought up a really good point because the manner in which they died seems to also speak to how much someone is allowed to grieve, or if it's a quote unquote shameful death. So I had the experience of a colleague who had a son who was lost in a tragic accident through no fault of his own. No drugs, no alcohol, no nothing, just tragic. And the outpouring of grief was remarkable and substantial. And then another colleague who lost a son near the same age to a drug overdose. And,
Mhm.
and the reaction was so starkly different. So can you talk about what, the tragic death versus the, overdose or suicide and how those left behind have different grieving?
Yes. So this is really a prominent issue in our society right now, especially when you look at fentanyl. For
Mm.
example, there is death by addiction, and then there's death by fentanyl poisoning. And the problem is, as you mentioned, like if someone dies in a tragic event, if it is a traumatic loss, like perhaps there was a casualty event, such as a shooting, a war, you could even say like a natural disaster, like a tsunami, an earthquake, etc. You see a lot of collective grief in those instances. The community comes together, they grieve, they support each other, they have so much compassion for each other. But then when you have this instance where someone dies due to perhaps they had fentanyl poisoning, they took a pill that they didn't know had fentanyl and they died. Or perhaps they did overdose or they had an addiction and it was a long-standing addiction. The compassion disappears because now you have individuals that are responding to those bereaved people and they're saying, well, your son or daughter was was a druggie. They were a junkie, and we have all of these rude terms
Oh, yeah.
and we don't think about how that impacts the person that's being directed towards.
Yeah, they
Um,
lost their loved one, and then there's not this groundswell of community support. I feel like they're almost ostracized.
Yeah, they are. They essentially are. And it's really, really just unfortunate because they're grieving. They are suffering just like any other person who is suffering. And if anything, they probably need even more support in those instances because that is a sudden death. That still counts as a traumatic death, in my opinion. And whether someone has addiction or not, or the circumstances, that should not really matter. What should matter is that someone has been lost and that someone is grieving that loss. I would argue that probably the reason this happens is there's so much stigma surrounding addiction as it is,
Yeah.
unfortunately. Yeah,
No, and you see that with certain disease states as well, kind of the judgment. If you have, breast cancer, there's 5Ks and there's ribbons and stuff. But if you have lung cancer, the first thing people ask is, oh, did you smoke?
right.
Either way, you're getting a diagnosis of cancer, and we pour so much judgment that grieving, like while they have a terminal diagnosis, is afraid. Now they are also have this additional weight of the judgment and the lack of support. And so I could see how that could easily happen based on the circumstances of the death.
Yes, yes. And, cancer is an interesting example because I've seen situations where people will say, like, well, that's a cancer that you can survive. So you shouldn't be that worried about dying. There's good medication for that. It's like, well, that's not the way to approach that scenario. That's not great. I've seen other instances where it's like, okay, you chose to take this alternative route to getting treatment, so the outcome is based off of your decision. That's not a comforting way to approach that either. I think people need to be less critical of these circumstances and more open-minded.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that applies to a lot of what we're talking about, criticism and invalidation and all of those things. I think they worsen the process.
Yeah, they do. They really do.
So, well, what advice would kind of wrapping it up? This has been an amazing conversation. And I love that we need to be comfortable talking about death. We need to
Yes.
bring it out. And this is not a shameful topic. This is not a hidden topic. This is a natural part of the human existence. And the
Mhm.
more we talk to experts like you and give people that permission and validation to experience what they're experiencing, I think it's so helpful. So I'm so grateful. So if somebody is currently dealing with a loss, what any kind of parting advice that you would give to that individual?
Hmm.
I know it's a lot. You've gone through a lot of advice, or any. I know you write a lot of articles about death positive topics and misconceptions. Just any good wisdom you want to leave us with.
I would say to allow yourself to grieve authentically. Sometimes we ask people, how are you doing after a loss, right? And they say, oh, I'm okay, or I'm doing all right. A lot of times they say that because they don't want to move forward with that conversation, right? I think we need to normalize the understanding that you might be okay in 5 minutes, and then something may happen. You may have a memory, you may just miss your loved one, any number of things could happen, and you might not be okay in the next 10 minutes. And that's all right. I always tell people to take it a day at a time, but I say if you can't take it a day at a time, then take it an hour at a time. And if you can't do that, take it 30 minutes or 10 minutes at a time. And it's going to vary. Sometimes you can cope with it, sometimes you can't. But what matters is that you're expressing that, because if you suppress it, that's when it becomes more problematic and more difficult for you to process as you move forward.
Yeah. Oh, that is so beautiful. I think that's so, I mean, some days it's just one breath at a time, but just that you're giving that, I feel like we almost need permission.
Allow yourself the permission to grieve. That's what it boils down to.
From a leading expert in thanatology, in death and dying. Everybody, were you listening? You have permission. How you feel is a-okay. So Elreacy, if people want to get a hold of you, maybe they have more questions, they want a grief group, they want to find your articles, your online appearances, what is the best way for people to find you?
So I can be found on my website.
Excellent.
Of course, my name is difficult to pronounce, but essentially everyone can go to www.elreacydock.com, and I have everything there, and they can contact me through there. And also my social media is under the same name. So it's really just a matter of people being able to spell my name and find me.
I feel you on that, sister, but mine's not even as complicated. We are going to put all of your contact information in the show notes, because I know that there are some people who are going to hear this and they're going to want to go deeper, read more of your articles, see more of your appearances, because this is a topic that we need to bring up multiple times. This is so important.
I agree. It's going to impact all of us at some point in our lives. So it's best to get familiar with it now.
Yeah, despite the best medical advances, the death count still remains one per person, as they say.
Right, exactly. We all experience death. You don't go through life without dying. So,
Exactly. So, well, thank you so much for being here. Tell your dogs I said hi.
Likewise.
We're dog moms. But truly, this was a fantastic, really impactful conversation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for tuning into Navigating Hope with me, Dr. Jaime Hope. It has been an honor to navigate the realms of health and wellness with you today. Remember, in the journey toward a healthier life, knowledge is your compass. If you enjoyed our time together, please share, like, and subscribe to Navigating Hope. Join us next week, where we'll continue to empower your health journey, arming you with the wisdom to navigate life's challenges and keep the emergency room in your rearview mirror.